I'm going to do a very, very brief run through some of the science of wireless radiation and the whole impacts that it is having on our health. So the whole electronic spectrum of radiation, I think everybody's familiar with the dangers of X-rays, which are your ionizing radiation, which we all know cause a great deal of damage to our DNA and so on. But as you get to longer and longer wavelengths, and this ranges from things like at the far end power lines, and then, for example, what we have with radio and TVs and cell phones and microwave radiations, and then infrared devices. Never mind, of course, as you get to shorter wavelengths, visible light, and so on. And the only concern that many people have had for years has been with the whole issue of heating. You know, you don't want to put something in a microwave, for example, metal, because it'll get way too hot. So there are many common sources of EMF radiation that I think we need to be aware of. And EMF, that we're concerned with here are the long wavelength things. So things, for example, like towers that are submitting things, even TV towers, our cell phone towers, and we're certainly seeing more of those, our cell phones, and, for example, Wi-Fi. So why do we really care? And I have to say that I'm especially concerned about cell phones. They were nominated by the US FDA to my National Toxicology program for study in 1999. And why is this? Is because usage has steadily increased. There are well over 300 million people in the US who are exposed, and over 5 billion people worldwide. Even in your least developed areas, you will find people with cell phones. Now, there have been a number of epidemiology studies that have demonstrated elevated risks of gliomas, which is a kind of brain cancer, and acoustic neuromas, which are basically a myelin sheath tumor. Myelin sheaths line our nerves so that you can have conduction of your nerve electricity, basically. This has been observed in heavy users of cell phones. And there are a huge number of different kinds of biological effects that have been observed, both in laboratory animals and in mechanistic studies. So there have been effects shown on genetic toxicity, effects on our immune system, changes in gene and protein expression, oxidative stress. I'm going to give you a few examples, changes in how cells differentiate and divide, proliferation, changes in when cells die, often inappropriately, permeability of the blood-brain barrier, which is also a huge concern. And we know that the human exposure to radio frequency is expanding. There are constantly more and more users, more applications, and newer technologies. And in 2011, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of WHO, classified RFR as possibly carcinogenic to humans. So what did the NTP cell phone studies show? And I should tell you, these are studies, as I said, nominated by FDA in 1999 and finally reported out 20 years later, almost in 2018. This was the largest study that NTP ever did, most expensive individual study that was ever done. But what they found was that high exposure to electromagnetic radiation in the kinds that was associated with our cell phones, was associated with clear evidence of tumors in the hearts of male rats. And these were the schwannomas, which are just like the neuromas. Some evidence of tumors in the brains of the male rats, and these were the malignant brain tumors, similar to what does occur in humans, and some evidence of tumors in the adrenal glands of male rats that were, some were benign, some were malignant, some were very complicated. And I should say, there was also indications of tumors in some of the mice. So I just had, as a scientist, I could not show you. Here's some examples of the similar tumors that we are seeing in our rodents. Now, we're not seeing the ears because no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't attach a cell phone to the ears of rats or mice. So in fact, they were exposed, their entire bodies were exposed. The part of the body that gets the most radiation, for example, is around your heart. And these are the linings of nerves around your heart. Myelin sheath linings are impacted. And this is STEM data showing, in fact, tumors that have arisen in the brains of the rats that have been exposed. But we also saw that there was DNA damage after only 3 months of exposure that we could detect both in the brains of rats and mice. And another thing that we saw, because the exposures in rats were started during pregnancy, we found that the pregnant rats gained less and their pups had low birth weight when they were born, and there was a decreased pup survival. I mean, these are all very concerning observations. And one thing I wanted to mention, this is some data that's been submitted for publication. The NTP is collaborating with the Ramazzini Institute in Italy, and I should mention that the Ramazzini Institute has also done a long-term rodent study using rats with cell phone radiation, and also found the cardiac schwannomas and some indications of brain tumors. But what in these studies, which are looking at molecular changes, they could find that the rat brain tumors had some of the same mutations as are observed in human tumors. So what NTP is continuing to study this. They're looking at the impacts of stress and behavior, are further evaluating these sites of where tumors were found in the rats. They're looking at what happens if you change the exposure. They're looking at heat, and I should mention that before the NTP started their 2-year studies, they made sure that the levels of EMF they were using did not heat the animals. They're studying more, looking at DNA damage and repair. Now, the initial study was done with the cell phone technology that was prevalent in, say, up to 2010 or 2012. Now we have not only 3 and 4G technologies, but 5. But I should mention that 5G includes 1G and 2G and 3G and 4G and 5G as well. So there are lots of other investigators who are busy experimentally studying the impacts. And in studies in mice that were done a couple years ago, they found that the EMF exposure in utero led to an increase in not only liver tumors, shown here are the hepatocellular carcinomas, but lung tumors and lymphomas. And the authors here said that their findings may help to understand the repeatedly reported increased incidences of brain tumors in heavy users of mobile phones. Now, there's also evidence, and again, that the developing organism is more sensitive, and so several studies have found decrease in damages in the brain. You can see this brain of the EMF exposed animals. Severely, the cells are all messed up, and they're finding there are fewer cells actually in a key region of the brain following the prenatal exposure to EMF. And it's not only the brain that's been shown to be impacted, but there's growing information that the testis is a susceptible tissue as well. This is a normal pathology slide through a normal testis, and it's pointing to the Sertoli cells, which are the ones that form your actual sperm. And what you can see in the treated animals is you have this huge space that is not present here in the Sertoli cell region, but is present, for example, in the treated testes. And the American Cancer Study actually funded a study where they found that the cancer, thyroid cancer explicitly, was increased significantly with regular cell phone use. And I think, the thyroid gland is not that far away from where the cell phone, unfortunately, people hold it. And I will say, before I forget, is that I'm not against cell phones. Don't hold them up to your ears. At least use earbuds or put it on speaker. So I mentioned before a little of the data we have from rats showing that the pups were affected by in utero exposure. And I showed you a little data of the impact in the brain. But we know that children are uniquely vulnerable to all sorts of exposures compared to adults. But when it comes to radiofrequency radiation, children have proportionately higher rates of absorption into their brain and body because they have thinner skulls. The bones are still developing and a higher content of water. And since their heads are smaller, there's only a shorter distance to get to different brain regions, especially things like the hippocampus and the thalamus, and more of a child's body is exposed to any one source. And we also have to be concerned about exposure to children's eyes. So again, children absorb proportionately more wireless radiation than adults. And WHO said that the average radio frequency radiation energy deposition for children exposed to mobile phone radiation is 2 times higher in the brain, 10 times higher in the bone marrow of the skull compared with mobile phone users and adults. Now, as I mentioned, children's brains and their whole bodies are more sensitive to exposure, again, not only to radio frequency radiation, but we know that pregnancy, infant, and childhood are critical periods of susceptibility, and especially for the developing brain. And why is that? Because you've got so many neurons rapidly growing, dividing, and you have to form the myelin sheath. Even very low levels of environmental exposure can have lifelong implications. We know that stem cells are more present and active in children and are more sensitive to wireless frequencies than fully developed cells. And consistently, animal and experimental studies find that even very low non-ionizing EMF exposures are associated with increases in oxidative stress. Our immune systems as children are more susceptible. And again, then you have a lifetime of daily exposure. So the FCC set radio frequency limits for cell phone radiation. And the last time they have been willing to do this is almost 30 years ago. Their science is outdated. It only focuses on the issues of heating, totally inadequate for women and children, and no consideration of what's happening to wildlife or our environment. A paper that I recently co-authored with Deborah Davis and others, and I should mention and thank both Deborah and Theodora Scarato for providing me some slides that I could use or grab parts from. But this paper was just published in a book for pediatricians especially. But the overview of experimental, epidemiological, and clinical evidence on the health impacts of wireless RFR electromagnetic fields indicates that the regulatories, both the FCC, and this is an international regulatory body, are inadequate. And we really need clinical and policy recommendations to reduce exposure and protect children. The Swiss government recently released an expert report focusing on the evidence for oxidative stress caused by electromagnetic fields, and they summarized both the animal and the cell experiments and concluded the majority of the animal and more than half of the cell studies provided evidence of increased oxidative stress caused by electromagnetic radiation. But I want to mention, I've mentioned a couple of health effects other than cancer, and it's important to remember cancer is just the tip of the iceberg here. There's lots of published research showing DNA damage, brain damage, sperm and reproductive effects, interactions between, for example, both the long wavelengths that we have with the radio frequency radiation and with, say, ionizing radiation, increase in headaches, oxidative stress, and a little bit to mention, effects on bees and insects and effects on trees. So this is just a recent paper. We'll look at the exposure of electromagnetic fields on insects, which showed, for example, in using 5G wireless communication, led to an increase in absorb power, which can cause changes in insect behavior, physiology, and morphology. So the Collegium Ramazzini, which is an honorary society of occupational and environmental health scientists, is issuing a statement. And I should mention that Pete Myers, as well as myself, are elected members of this organization, that health effects and exposure limits to radio frequency electronic fields need to be reevaluated without delay and be based on scientific evidence from reliable studies published over the past 30 years. Now, not everybody is as slow acting as our country. Unfortunately, others are acting. So France has the SAR is the specific absorption rate, and France requires that to be mandatory for labeling. And you can't sell or advertise cell phones for children, and Wi-Fi is banned in kindergarten. In Belgium, there's again a ban on sale or advertising of cell phones for young kids, and Wi-Fi is banned in some of the nursery schools. Israel also has mandatory labeling and Wi-Fi being banned in nursery, and they try to minister it with a recommendation to reduce exposure. India has mandatory labeling and recommendations to reduce exposure. Cyprus is running a Wi-Fi removal from elementary classrooms, but trying to alert parents and so on, and pregnant women especially. French Polynesia, again, awareness campaigns and certain bans. And Italy decreed the environment minister on that we need to reduce some EMF exposures. So I'm happy to answer questions either now or later, but I wanted to make the point that our cell phone radiation is ongoing, and here we have a man about to step. We could have been off a cliff. This is into a hole. So thank you very much for your attention. Can EMF be an endocrine disruptor? The answer is broadly defined, absolutely. That it is interfering with numerous processes that are endocrine mediated. How that happens, we really don't know yet, and it's a fertile field for work. I think what our audience is hearing is there may be more questions than there are answers, but as Pete said, we know enough that we could do something about it.
We have a question. Linda made a couple of suggestions on how to mitigate these harmful effects using earphones, speakerphone. Are there other things we know in terms of daily consumer use or practice that could get the word out in terms of mitigation?
You don't want to be right next to, say, a cell phone tower. That's probably not good for your health. And there's some data that we have that suggests that. So I'm a pragmatist. I do the things that make sense. Pete's book, when it came out, Our Stolen Future in 1996, from that point on, I stopped microwaving in plastic, and I stopped storing things in plastic because it was easy to do. And I think that we need to have people doing what comes easily first, because that's something you can do from now on. So, I mean, I've got my cell phone right here, for example, but you're never going to see me put it up to my ear. And I just think that that's an easy thing to do. I think when you can use wired devices instead of cell phone devices, for example. Not at all easy, but it is doable. Landry, I think if you have some specific good recommendations, that would be real helpful.
My home's hardwired. It's not always hard to do. You can hardwire a lot of your electronic devices. Environmental Health Trust and Americans for Responsible Technology have great guides on how to reduce personal exposure. What's been really tricky for me is the schools, but this is so much larger when you go to work, when you're out at school, it's really everywhere. That's why we need a larger concerted effort. Are there any studies showing the effects of EMF on unicell organisms? These could conceivably be easier to conduct.
Growing number of studies using different kinds of organisms, invertebrates as well as vertebrate organisms, and lots of studies are being done in isolated cells from humans, from other animals, and there are some studies on I don't know specifically of any studies like on amoeba or paramecium or something like that, or single-celled algae. I don't know whether they've been done, but certainly cell studies are being done, and that's providing a lot of the understanding of how EMF can be causing its adverse effects.
Anything about the connection between pesticides and EMF exposure and towers and pollinators?
Well, we know pesticides are bad for our insect populations, which are crashing in many areas. And we now have data showing that EMF, it can be problematic for insects as well. When you got both going on, are we having a synergism and we have a much greater effect? I think those are, again, perfectly valid and important questions to be asking. It's hard for people often to understand when they can't see a direct impact. When you look at, for example, say in the virus, you could isolate the virus and show it was there, and you could show that when the virus went away, hopefully most people recovered. Or if you blocked infection with the virus, people didn't get sick. It's very, very hard when you're dealing with a public health issue to identify a smoking gun for proof. And there's a great deal of resistance that comes about this, even from the medical community, which often, wants to see the proof, definitive proof. And I often remind them, we have no controlled studies to show that lead impacts the IQ of our children. We have no controlled studies to show that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer in a whole. But as more and more work is conducted and more history accumulates, the consensus will start to build that you have problems here. And I think that EMF is at the point that we can really start building that consensus.